Today, we are going to be delving into the world of child custody evaluation. What are they? Who orders them? Why should the court listen to what this man has to say anyway?
The idea of the law, they're asking me to determine what's in the best interest of their children. Family law requires that certain things need to be done. The two parents are really intensely emotional, so they're not going to make good decisions. No human being is when we have intense emotions. 70 or 80% of our communication is nonverbal. It's important for me to see how they respond.
Hi, I'm Ruby Bolton,
Hello, I'm Dr. Jim Zettel.
and this is Divorce Decoded.
Who is Jim Zettel? He's a licensed psychologist, he's a doctor, he's a diplomat in school neuropsychology. Dr. Zettel founded Family Psychiatry of the Woodlands. Courts all over this area rely on him and they trust his opinion. He has extensive experience working with children and families and couples going through a divorce. Dr. Zettel is the co-owner of Optima Forensic Psychological Services and the Woodlands Behavioral Health and Wellness Center. In addition, he is the clinical director for the Houston Recovery Campus run by the University of Texas Houston Health Sciences Center.
I am super excited to have with me today Dr. Jim Zettel, who is a licensed psychologist and one of the experts that I see in the courtroom frequently on both sides of the table. And I'd like to say thank you so much, Dr. Zettel, for joining us.
You're welcome.
So,
Glad to be here.
can you start by telling us a little bit about what your background is and what qualifies you as an expert in the family courts?
Okay, well, I have a PhD in clinical psychology. I have postdoctoral certifications in forensic psychology, psychopharmacology, and family therapy.
And how long have you been practicing?
I've probably done around 25,000 hours in practice.
Wow. So that's amazing. So what I thought we'd really focus on today is a child custody evaluation. Now, a child custody evaluation is something that the court will order and then appoint somebody, and usually it's by the agreement of the parties who they're going to appoint. And if the two sides can't agree, then the court's just going to pick somebody, right?
Yes, just generally custody evaluations happen when there's a high conflict divorce.
And how long have you been doing child custody evaluation?
I started custody evaluations probably 20 years ago, stopped for a while, and just restarted about 4 years ago.
So I can tell you, as a divorce attorney, there are not a whole lot of qualified child custody evaluators out there. And most of the psychologists that people work with will not do custody evaluations, right?
Correct.
And why do you think that is? Why are there so many people that draw a line at this?
Because most therapists or people in the mental health field, they don't like to be in a situation where there's a lot of conflict like you find in a typical courtroom where it's adversarial. They find that difficult.
So just to kind of let the audience know what a child custody evaluation is, a child custody evaluation would be requested where two parties, and usually it's mom and dad, but not always, right? Two parties are both seeking custody of a child. And one of the things that you and I discussed when we were talking about doing this together is, isn't that a weird thought? I mean, when people have children, it's not something anyone would ever anticipate that you're going to pull in a third person who's going to decide what should happen with that child.
Yes. Yes.
And it's just such a strange construct for us to be in. Don't you think?
Yeah, and the idea of the law is you want to do a custody evaluation to determine what's the best interest of the kid. And when you think about it, they're asking me to determine what's in the best interest of their children.
And you've never met these children before, right?
That's correct. Yes.
So you do provide therapy for children, but you would never do a child custody evaluation on a current patient, right?
No, no, that would be unethical.
Right.
Yeah. You want to
So,
be as objective as possible when you're doing the custody evaluation.
so I think we all agree that the best situation where parents decide that they can no longer live together is if the parents themselves can decide what's in the best interest of the children, right?
You would think so.
Yeah, and sometimes it's easy for you and I and the other people in these highly contested divorce world to forget, but most of the time that's actually what happens, right?
Yes.
And yeah, in the vast majority of cases, both parents agree on who a child should live with
Yes.
and what kind of rights
Yes.
they should have.
By far.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the majority of divorces wind up where the parents agree on what's going to happen with their children.
So any type of disagreement in front of the court where you're asking a third party to decide is actually super rare.
Yes.
And I will say, too, my own experience where I've asked for a child custody evaluation, sometimes those cases go to trial, but a whole lot of times they don't, right?
Yes. They can be mediated before. Yep.
And let's look at what a child custody evaluation is.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sure. So the law, the Texas law actually requires, family law requires that certain things need to be done. You need to be able to do psychological testing on the parents to make sure there's no psychological problem with the parent. You need to observe the parent and the child together. You need to interview the child. You need to interview collaterals.
So what are collaterals?
Collaterals are people that a mom may say, hey, I want you to talk to my neighbor, Mrs. Jones. So we do that. You have to make a home visit, go to the home.
So you physically go
I
to
do.
the home of everybody involved.
Yes, I do. Yep. So you make home visits. And then the most difficult part of this is when you have to bring the opposing parents together and have a meeting with them. That's always the most difficult thing.
So how can that go wrong, and what does it look like when it goes right?
Well, if it's of a high conflict divorce, it could be a situation where they're just going to talk about all the past hurts, all the past conflicts. They want to talk about that. And so as a custody evaluator, what you want to do then, you want to try to keep them focused on the idea of what's happening with the custody evaluation. And you do want to give them a hint on how you're going to rule in your evaluation relative to the children.
Why do you want to give them that hint?
Because I think it's important for parents in this kind of situation to have some kind of idea of where this may go.
So is that so that they can stay out of a courtroom, or is that so that they can change their current behavior?
Well, that may be. The second thing would be really good. But the other thing, it's important for me to see how they respond, because that's going to give me more information to put in my evaluation of how they respond about what they think is going to be the best interest of their kid.
So what kind of responses do you get from somebody when you drop a hint that, hey, I've got some concerns and I'm thinking that this other parent maybe can deal with this child a little better?
You have to be careful about that. A better way to talk about what's the best interest of a kid is to talk about, look, ongoing high conflict between parents has an adverse effect on child development, both emotionally and even physically. So I always talk about that, and to see if they're going to accept it as a group or if they're going to continue to blame one another.
So actually, you bring up a good point there when you talk about the high conflict of the parents, because that's something that I see a lot of parents really worried about, where they say, well, if I get divorced, I don't want my child to be from a broken home, or how is it going to affect the child? But there have been a lot of studies talking about what happens to a child who remains in a home where the parents are in high conflict.
Yes.
And they're not able to work. They keep living together,
Yes.
but they can't really co-parent. And what kind of effect does that have?
Well, just like I said earlier, high conflict between the parents, ongoing chronic high conflict, definitely has a negative effect on child development,
And
emotionally, physically, even cognitively, even intellectually. So it's really important that people identify high conflict and try to get those people in treatment or to do something about it.
so, do you see situations where one parent is being very conscientious and trying to minimize that conflict as much as possible, and the other parent isn't? Or is it usually they're both on the same page? Either they're both trying to do what they can, or they're both duking it out?
Well, I think I've had situations where both of those have occurred, where you have one parent that's really trying to be more conscious of how the conflict is adversely affecting the children, and you have one parent that doesn't care or has their own personal needs that are more important than their children's needs. And that's generally what happens in high conflict divorces, is that one or both parents, their own personal needs are more important than the needs of the children.
And when you make that determination, how does that affect your recommendation?
That's a great question. If I think that both parents are really their personal needs are more important than the children's needs, I'm definitely going to recommend some kind of treatment for that. So that would be co-parenting classes or even family therapy. I've found recently that co-parenting sessions are educational experiences for these parents. It's not really effective until you do family therapy first, because you have to put these high conflict parents into family therapy, kind of to teach them how to reduce the tension in the relationship, and then you teach them co-parenting skills.
And how long does that take?
Depends on how disturbed the parents are. You know, that's the idea. That if a couple could have some real significant psychopathology, one or both of them could have a personality disorder. They could be depressed or anxious, so that has to be taken care of too.
So you mentioned earlier all the different levels at which children are affected by continuing high conflict between the parents. I'd like to kind of go back and look at those individually. The first thing you said was emotionally.
Yes.
So what sorts of emotional effects do you see children showing when their parents drag them into and exhibit high conflict in front of them?
Well, it's not only for children in high conflict divorce, but also children who are just going through divorce and the parents may be cooperating. Worry. All kids that are going through any kind of divorce, the first thing they're going to do is worry. And if that isn't addressed, that can move into anxiety, okay, like clinical anxiety. And if that isn't addressed, then what a kid will do, they'll move into clinical depression. So the way you can avoid all that, especially in regular divorces, is to make sure that you have at least one parent that is emotionally attached to the kid.
And how do you do that?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Emotional attachment, you just don't do it like that. It's going to take time. Like, for example, let's just talk about attachment. After a child is born, it's going to take at least 11 or 12 months for a child to be securely attached to the mom or the father. Okay, so it's a process that takes a while. It just doesn't happen like that. So as the child develops, most kids are securely attached to their parents unless there's something severely wrong with the parents. So, but as the child develops, the kid changes, right? So when a kid changes, and if the parent isn't resourceful enough, the secure attachment can move to insecure attachment. And insecure attached kids, that's predictive of children having problems later on in adolescence and adulthood. So you want to make sure that you're securely attached to your kids, obviously. So divorce can interfere with that attachment process.
So if you've got a parent who's going through a divorce and they're starting to feel more distant from their child, what would you recommend they do to help heal that and to reestablish that attachment?
Well, you could teach them relationship enhancement skills. There are certain things that you can do with a kid that can promote secure attachment. And when you have a younger kid, like 4, 5, and 6, you can teach a parent a particular play skill that only takes 5 minutes. And within that 5 minutes, if the parent does just particular behaviors and eliminates other behaviors, it can really facilitate secure attachment.
So what are some of the behaviors you'd want to encourage?
For the parent,
Correct.
well, one of the things, so let's talk about the relationship enhancement skills for, let's say, a 5-year-old child. Okay. Yeah, the parent would introduce play. Okay. But during the playtime, the parent would do 3 things and only 3 things during that 5 minutes. After the 5 minutes are up, they can go about and be their regular parent. But during that 5 minutes, they want to listen in a particular way and they want to do certain things. One of the things they want to do is just describe the child's behavior. Like, gee, Johnny, you put the red block on the green block. Okay. That's just a descriptive behavior that the parent would do to describe the child's behavior. What that does for the child begins to understand that, gee,
I'm being paid attention to.
Mom is really paying attention to me when I'm doing something I'm having fun with. Okay, so that's the first behavior. Now the second behavior is a thing where you do labeled praise, and it's probably the most powerful thing that a parent can do with a kid that age. And it goes something like this: well, gee, Johnny, you put the red block on the green block. You did that so well.
Or look how tall you've made your tower.
Yeah. Or, gee, Mommy really appreciates how quiet you play with me. So that label praise, very, very powerful. It's the most powerful behavior a parent can do with a kid 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and up to 9.
Okay, find something very specific that they're doing well and let them know, I notice you're doing this and this is great.
Yes. Yep. Mm-hmm. And it only takes 5 minutes. So we know from our research, if you go over 5 minutes, the kid will get satiated and it won't be as a powerful effect. So what I have to do is try to teach parents, look, we just want to do this 5 minutes. So what we do, we bring them into my playroom and we teach those skills and they model it for us and we reinforce the parents so they become good at that. And then the third behavior that they want to do during that 5 minutes is called reflective listening. So if the child says something during the session, like the child would say, gee, I had a bad day at school. Instead of saying, well, what happened to you at school, which would be a question, which interferes with the kid's stream of consciousness, the parent would say something like this: yes, it seems like you had a bad day at school. It just reflects what the kid does. But after the playtime is over, the 5 minutes is over, then the parent would want to say, hey, look, what happened to you at school? That's when you start asking
If the
questions.
child doesn't say themselves.
Correct.
But if one of the things I've noticed, so I've got 5 kids myself,
Yep.
is a lot of times a child will say something and you think they're going in one direction and really what's troubling them is something else. So like, for instance, in that case where, Johnny says, I had a bad day at school. And if the parent says, what happened at school? Well, then he's talking at school. But if what you say is, you had a bad day at school? And then Johnny says, yeah, and I was really mad, and I came home, and I was mean to my little sister. Then what was really bothering him maybe wasn't what he initially said.
Yes.
In other words, the kid's wanting to go in a completely different direction.
Right.
Yep. Which I see. It's funny. I was talking to my 19-year-old son yesterday, and we were discussing something, and I thought I knew exactly where he was heading. And dang, no.
Yeah.
19 years, you think I'd know him pretty well, but
Yeah, you're right.
still learning a lot. So going back to the child custody evaluations, those skills that you just talked about, are those things that you're specifically looking to observe when you watch the parent?
Yes, I think the unique thing that I do when I do a custody evaluation, I actually bring the parent and the child into my playroom, okay? Mm-hmm. And I tell the parent, what I want you to do is just play with your child for 20 minutes. Okay, and the playroom has a lot of things in it that the kid can go get, the parent can go get, and they sit down at this big long table and they start to play. Okay, and then I tell them, so after the playtime, I want you to have a 5 minute discussion with your kid, 3 or 5 minutes, and then after the discussion, I want you to have a cleanup period, because then when you clean up afterwards, it gives me an opportunity to see how the parent gives commands. So that's important. And then how the child responds to the commands. So during the playtime, I'm looking for those things. I'm looking, does the child give good eye contact? That's one of the things I look for. But what I'm looking for the parent is looking, does the parent do labeled praise? Does the parent describe the kid's behavior? Does the parent do reflective listening? So I'm looking for that. And if I see that, even in high conflict divorces, that's a really good thing, because what that's telling me is that that kid is likely to be securely attached to that parent. And that's a good thing. So when you think about the law says, what's the best interest of the child? That's the
Right.
law. Well, how do you operationalize that? What does that exactly mean? Well, from a psychologist's perspective, what it means to me is the kid is securely attached. Is the kid is securely attached, and the parent can do other kind of things like making sure the kid is fed, going to school, and those other kind of things. Well, then that's a good thing. Okay, that's going to be a good place for this child if they're securely attached to this parent.
So let's talk about secure attachment for a little while, because one of the things that I have heard from parents before it is either mom or dad say, well, I know that the child is most attached to me because when I go to leave, they're hanging onto my knees and they're crying and they're upset. And when the other parent goes to leave, they just say, hey, sweetie, I'll be back in a second. And the kid's like, okay, bye. And to the parent, and I've heard it from both parents, meaning that I've heard a parent say, I don't know why they're more attached to the other parent than me, because the other parent will never do anything, and have done so much for this child, and they mean everything in the world to me, and yet, when the other parent goes to leave, they're crying for them, and they don't cry for me. And then I've heard it where clearly the child is most attached to me. What can you explain what's really going on there in a situation where the child is desperately afraid or upset when a parent leaves?
That could be a sign of a child being anxiously attached to the parent and not securely attached. So let's talk about attachment real quick. So generally, a human being is going to be either securely or insecurely attached to other human beings, okay? And children, obviously. So we want secure attachment. And so insecure attachment, you can be kind of anxious and also avoidant. So an anxious kid would be the clingy kid. That would be an anxiously, insecurely attached child. The other child that says, "Oh, mom, you're going out for grocery shopping," and the kid says, "Okay, mom, we'll see you later." That's generally going to be a securely attached kid.
So what you're saying is that the child, that it doesn't make him or her nervous for the parent to leave for a minute. That doesn't mean they don't love the parent. It just means they can count on that parent. They know that parent's coming back.
Yes, and the parent in his or her relationship with that child has produced what we call a secure base for that child. So once a child understands that they have a secure base, that gives that little human the opportunity to go out and start to explore the world, right? And that's what we want with our kids. We want our kids to be independent. But if we have a mother who's too involved in the kid's life and there's not a balance in that relationship, the kid can really become anxious and there's not a secure base, and therefore doesn't want to go out and explore.
So let me ask you, how valid do you think your opinions of somebody's parenting can be after a limited number of hours and observations? What do you say to those parents that are like, well, what does he know? He sat there with us for, 6 hours, 8 hours. I've spent 9 years with this child. His opinion is meaningless. Why should the court even listen to him?
Because my answer to that is, how's it working out for your kid? So that's why I see the kid a lot. In my evaluations, I may see a child between 10 and 15 hours. And here's the reason why. Because with young kids, you can't trust them to be consistent after just 2 or 3 sessions because they're kids, right? And they don't understand reality like we do. But if you see a kid for several sessions, you get to see trends. Okay, and a good example would be, a trend would be a kid may say, well, I don't like going to dad's house, the first time I see him. Okay, but over time, that may change. And he may be saying, well, yeah, I do like dad because he does X, Y, and Z with me. So it's not like he initially said. So you have to be careful about that. So just seeing a kid 1 or 2 times, I don't think that's enough time to get a trend on what a kid is really like. And so in that kind of situation, the way I respond to that, well, how's this working out for your child? Look at what your child is doing. So if the child is really acting out, if the child is really showing some kind of problems with anxiety or depression, or the child is withdrawing, or the child has even some kind of developmental delays, then that's a sign that it isn't working out with the child in that relationship with that parent. So,
But what do you say to the parent who says, why is it my fault? Okay, you're saying that, let's say you're recommending for dad to have custody, and mom is saying, well, okay, so my child has anxiety and my child has these issues, but you know what? I have mental health issues. It's genetic. It's not my bad parenting. Why does he think it's my fault that the child's doing this? How can he recommend for another parent?
well, I would agree with that it's not necessarily your fault, but it's your responsibility to understand.
I love that distinction.
Okay.
That is so good because that's something that I hear a lot is, and we try to correct that, but this is your fault. This is your fault. Something can be not at all your fault,
Yes.
and yet you still have the ability to help, and so don't you have the responsibility to
Yes.
help?
And for example, like, here's another good example. Like our literature says, depressed moms, their relationship with their child leads to insecure attachment, and that's not good for the kids. That's what the literature says. But you can find an individual depressed mom who is still meeting the needs of her child. So that's why custody evaluation is important. A judge may hear, oh, well, Mrs. Smith is depressed. In the literature, and I know the literature, and so I'm going to give the kid to the dad most of the time. That's inappropriate because if you did a custody evaluation and you got a good look at that mom and how she's interacting with her children, she could be depressed and still manage her moods when she's parenting. She hasn't forgot about parenting just because she's sad, and she could be an effective parent.
And you can only tell that by observing
Yes.
the interactions. So
And also doing an evaluation of her and talking with her and observing her. That's correct.
So one of the things that the code says is that a custody evaluation can involve psychometric testing or it cannot involve psychometric testing. Can you explain what psychometric testing is?
A psychometric testing is when you give a person a psychological test, and the most popular one is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI, right? Okay.
Right.
So, and what that does, it's a long established test. It's a very robust test. It gives us really good results, has a lot of validity to it. So, and you give that, and that will help you diagnose the person if they have any kind of things going on, like a personality disorder, anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, a thought disorder, and things like that. And those could, like we were talking about earlier, could adversely affect parenting. So you want to find that out. So that's what psychometric testing is. The problem with psychometric testing and custody evaluations is that when people find themselves in a forensic environment, they tend to underreport. And what that means is they fake good.
Sure. They're not coming to you saying, hey, I need help. They're coming to you saying, hey, I'm perfect.
That's it.
And this other person,
That's it.
Oh my gosh, they've caused so many problems,
That's
you know?
it. Yep.
Right. So
Yeah.
how do you correct for that?
Well, we have validity scales, and so we can tell if a person's lying. We can tell if they're over-reporting or under-reporting. And about 30% of cases in a forensic setting are under-reporting. and about 70% we get good enough information.
I'm actually really surprised. It's only 30%.
30%. Yeah. Okay. And then what you do, you have other tests, and you have your clinical interview, and you have other ways of dealing with that. And so that's the good thing about some of these tests. They have these validity measures that tell us how the person's attitude is when they're answering the questions on the test.
So I actually really appreciated when you said that, hey, overall depression may lead to this problem, but in this particular case, it's fine. I've been doing this for a long time, 30 years now, and I see certain trends in child custody. And I will say that when I started, if you could establish, antidepressant or bipolar or, some other issue, the person that you were establishing had those issues, anxiety, OCD, I mean, the list could go on, right? The person that you were establishing had those issues, tended to lose custody.
Yes.
And I will say, I don't think that's the case anymore. How do you feel about that?
Well, I know when I'm doing my custody evaluations, I'm talking about functionality.
Yeah.
So, like I said earlier, a mom could be depressed, but she's dealt with her depression long enough. She's developed a way of coping with them effectively that it doesn't adversely affect her parenting. And so I think that's a great thing.
Yeah.
And I think we had a situation a long time ago where there was an alcoholic mom. Remember?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
So, yes, we
And-
ought to tell the audience, you and I have worked together
Yes.
on lots of cases, but I actually first met you when you were testifying for the other side,
Yes.
and you've had the poor judgment to testify against me in other cases, too. No, I will say that I absolutely have seen people being much, and I think it's a good thing, seeing the courts be much more understanding of the fact that we don't have any perfect parents out there,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And the fact that somebody has an issue doesn't mean that they can't parent necessarily,
Yes.
right?
They can be good enough parents.
Yeah, so it is something, of course, somebody going through divorce, that's always going to have a huge effect, right? It's one of the most traumatic periods in a person's life. And that's something that over the years I've had clients say, well, I don't, is it okay to, I've been feeling sad, but I don't want to take antidepressants because it will go against me, And my advice to my clients is usually, let's talk to your therapist, talk to a psychiatrist.
Yes.
And if antidepressants are appropriate, you're finding that you're having difficulty coping during a stressful period and taking an appropriate action really might be beneficial, make you look better, and help you in a custody battle.
Yes, because think about that, what that kind of model teaches a child.
Mm-hmm.
It teaches a child that an adult, a significant adult in their life can have some difficulties, but the adult takes responsibility for those difficulties and tries to make him or herself better. That's a really good thing to teach a kid.
Right.
That teaches a kid that, look, it's not all roses out there. Humans can have difficulties and struggles, but it's important to struggle well and to struggle responsible. And that's that's what you want to teach a parent if you have some of those difficulties, because like you said earlier, no human being is perfect. There's not a perfect parent. Okay.
And when the court asks you, so a custody evaluator gives a recommendation, right? You're
Yes.
going to tell the court, and they don't have to do it, but it's an official recommendation. This is what I recommend, you do for this child,
Yes.
what I think is in this child's best interest.
Yes.
So as a court-appointed custody evaluator, if you, during the time period, have an opportunity to see that one of these parents started to struggle and they took an appropriate action and now they're doing better, wouldn't that be something that would actually indicate in their favor?
Yes.
Because we all struggle sometimes, right?
Yes, we do.
And I think, I haven't seen a statistic on this. Maybe you have. I remember being very surprised when I had some personal conversations with a number of friends, finding out how many people that I was close with either were or had been on antidepressants or anxiety medication or ADD medication. And I had a moment where I kind of thought, well, hold on, if there are so many people with these issues, is this just life that we ought to be dealing with? Should we be turning to medication? And then I thought about, honestly, glasses, right? You're wearing glasses, I'm wearing contact lenses. Huge percentage of the population needs assistance with vision.
Yes.
And so what do? They go and they get assistance with vision. And there's no failure.
Correct.
There's no judgment.
Yes.
Your eyes didn't work at their optimal level. And so you recognized it and you did something about it.
Yes.
Or braces, the
Yeah.
same thing. A huge percentage of our population, well over half, I think, will get braces on their teeth, and it's not something where a parent's traumatized. Oh no, my child needs braces. How did I fail them? No, it's just, oh, kid needs braces. Let's do something about it.
Yes.
And so my own thoughts are, I'm really glad that I believe we're coming to have that attitude towards mental health issues. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with that. I think that when people have a mental health issue, it's important that they take responsibility and we support them to get the care that they need. And I've noticed clinically, and there's a little stuff in the literature that here's a good example. Let's talk about adolescent depression real quick. So kids who go through depression as an adolescent, if they get the help that they need and they learn how to cope with that, when they become young adults, they are so much more sophisticated psychologically about themselves and their relationship with other young adults because they've struggled early in their development and they've overcome it.
Yeah.
And that gives them a really sense of confidence about themselves and allows them to really do well in relationship with young adults who haven't had that struggle. So there you go.
Well, I think that's great. And I will say, too, that's something that I see a lot with parents that they want to they feel a sense of personal failure if their child is having an issue.
Yes.
And if a child is having a problem, is that necessarily the result of misparenting?
That's a good point. I think there's this thing called, the psychobabble term is attribution theory. And what that means is that if my kid is doing good, that means I'm a good parent.
Yes.
If my kid is doing bad, that means I'm a bad parent. So, what we know now is DNA, our genetics really have a much more profound influence on our outcomes than our experiences. And so if you have a kid that is really different from you, that's going to result in some conflict, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. But we have to understand that DNA is really more predictive of what our kids are doing than how we're nurturing them or parenting them.
So, in other words, if you have a child suffering from depression, help the child, and it doesn't necessarily mean either parent is doing anything wrong.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, the idea is just be a responsible parent. If you see a child struggling, like, for example, with a mental health problem, be responsible about it. Get this kid some help. And that's the responsible thing to do, especially with young kids and adolescents.
So the Texas code indicates that most times the judge, the presumption is that it's in the child's best interest to have what we call a standard possession order, right? Mm-hmm. Where they might live with one parent, but then they have very frequent visits with the other parent. And I think people don't realize how much contact there is for the parent that the child doesn't primarily live with. So in Texas, it's as much as like 41% of the time they spend with the other parent. So there's really quite a bit of time with both parents when that schedule is followed. Would you agree with the Texas legislature that in most cases an arrangement like that is in the child's best interest?
Yes, I agree with that. But remember, in our earlier discussion, remember with younger kids, just 5 minutes doing certain things with a kid is really going to profoundly impact the relationship between the parent and the child in a positive way. So I'm not so interested in the quantity of time. I'd be more interested in making sure that the parents understand how to develop a quality relationship with their child.
So if I'm a parent and I was in a custody battle and I just lost, meaning that my child is going to spend every Thursday of the school night with me. They're going to spend first, third, and fifth weekends. I'm going to take them to school on Monday. I'm going to have them 30 days over the summertime. Like I said, it ends up being about 40% of the time. But I used to have them 100. And so it's, if as that parent who just lost, I'm like, well, how can I affect my child now? I'm not going to, I'm going to lose all, influence over my child. How do you respond to that parent?
Well, first of all, not necessarily. The kid could be securely attached to the parent who's spending less time. And so if the parent understands that and can maintain that secure attachment, it doesn't make any difference if it's 20% or 40%. It's the quality. It's what the parent is doing with the child that's the most important thing, not the time.
So, and in fact, when we hear about studies saying, well, shared parenting is best for the child, Texas's standard possession order counts as shared parenting,
Yes.
correct? Because there's so much time given to the what we might refer to as the non-custodial parent that they're still deeply involved and have an opportunity to really impact that child. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah.
So the different elements of a child custody evaluation, you mentioned that you would spend, I think, about 10 hours with the child,
Yes.
right? How many hours would you spend with each parent?
Around 6.
Okay. And so you mentioned that you have a meeting with the two parents together. The child's not there for that, right?
No, child is not there.
Well, yes. And how long does that meeting tend to be?
About an hour and a half.
And why do you think that that's such an important element of a child custody evaluation?
Well, I think for some child custody evaluation, it's I don't do it, and the reason I don't do it, here's an example. If I know that one parent, the way he or she was operating with their child, caused the child's depression, I'm not going to even entertain, and I'll explain that in the evaluation, that it doesn't make any sense for us to have a meeting with the parents. Because, in fact, I won't even do an observation with that parent and the child because I know the child has, I've got information from the child that the cause of the depression has been interaction with the parent. And I'll have to explain that in the custody evaluation to the judge why I didn't do that, which is supposed to have been done in the custody evaluation.
So in a situation like that, would you ever recommend to the court that a child gets less? I'm not a child. A parent gets less than a standard possession order?
Yes,
And how often do you do that?
not often, but I have done it.
And what kind of circumstances, in what manner could a parent interact with a child that might cause depression or cause you to make a recommendation to the court that there be less time?
Well, in this particular instance, it was a father who was just, what he was doing was promising his young daughter certain things and then reneging on his promises. So that's another predictor of secure attachment and how well your child will develop is that if you have consistent parenting, which includes consistent nurturing, but also consistent discipline.
So let me ask you this. You mentioned that one of the reasons you like to spend so much time with a child before giving an opinion is because they change over time.
Yes.
Do you see a lot of evidence that the parents are trying to coach the child and get them to tell you certain things?
Yes, I do see that.
And how
Yeah.
do you know that that's happening? Because that's a fear a lot of my clients have is, the child's going to say this because the other parent will have had them right beforehand and they're feeding it into them. And I usually do try to reassure them and say, look, they're used to this, they see this. How can you tell when that's being done and when it's the child's real feelings?
Well, the way I can tell is because the kid tells me.
The kid tells you that
Because I asked
he's
them,
been told?
yeah, I ask those kind of questions. I don't ask them directly, but over time, over 10 or 11 sessions, and I develop a really good relationship with these kids. I'll ask kind of indirect questions, and sometimes I'll ask direct questions. Does mommy or daddy tell you what to say about mommy or daddy? No. Yes. Okay. What do they tell you? Oh, I don't know. And then I may have another session. Well, let's go over this again. And that's in my head. And they'll say, well, they say that mom's an idiot. Dad says that mom's an idiot. Okay.
Yeah, which tells you
so-
something, right?
Yeah. So it comes out, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the parent is purposely trying to alienate the child. It could be the mom was just ventilating, or dad was just ventilating, right? So you have to. That's why you have to see these people longer. You have to be careful just getting one or two bits of information. You got to be able to establish some kind of trends. And here's the other thing. Look, 70 or 80% of our communication is nonverbal. Okay, so a kid comes in after visiting dad, and mom says, "Well, how was your visit with dad?" And the kid says, "Oh, we didn't do anything." And mom says, "Yeah." Well, what did that tell a little 8-year-old kid? They see
I didn't
that.
think you would.
Yeah, that's it, or something
Of
like
course,
that.
your dad's a piece of crap, you know?
There you go. Or just walking away when a kid is trying to, just walking away when a kid is trying to communicate to mom, well, this is what I did at dad's, or what I didn't do at dad's. That tells the kid that the mom has a negative view of dad.
Yeah.
And you can't, you just, I tell parents, you can't avoid it. I mean, not unless you're really super, super aware of your nonverbal language. And so what you want to do when a kid comes home, comes back to you, you want to engage the kid and say, hey, what's going on? And make it positive. Oh, well, that's great. Yeah, it looks like you had a good time. Oh, too bad you didn't do anything. Maybe next time. That sort of stuff, rather than, oh, yeah, that's him.
Yeah, what did you expect to happen?
Yeah.
So I will say, I'm glad you brought up that about it being intentional, because when I talk about these trends that I see in family law over time,
Yes.
you know, for a while, a great big trend was parental alienation,
Yes.
right? Which is that the child is being poisoned away from one parent by the other parent.
Yes.
And in my experience, and I think almost anybody who does much family law can tell you, that absolutely does happen.
Yes.
There are 100% that does happen. But my feeling is that most of the time, the parent isn't doing it on purpose.
Yes.
Yeah.
And especially, for example, a really good example of you have parents who may have a histrionic aspect to their personality. Okay?
Right. Everything is 100 or 0. There's nothing in the middle.
Histrionic people are storytellers.
Yeah.
So they tell stories.
Oh,
and the
sorry.
stories may or may not be based on reality, right? But it doesn't mean they're alienating their kid. All right. So that's why you have to do an assessment on the parents to see if they have those kind of traits or styles to their personality.
They'll be like, "You don't worry, you'll be home soon," and then they'll be called. What did Daddy remember to
Yes.
feed you?
Yep.
And you got to be sure. Did Daddy change your clothes? And when that visit is coming, then the parent gets more and more anxious about it. And are you okay? Are you okay?
Yep.
And then the child comes back, and it's like, "Let me look at you. How did this happen?
Yep.
Did Daddy hurt you?
Yep.
You know?"
Yep.
And I will say in that instance, the mother I'm describing, and this isn't a particular case. I mean, I'm talking about things you see a lot, right?
Yes.
Genuinely loves her child, is genuinely worried about her child. And if you ask her, do you say negative things about Daddy? She'll say, never. I would never do that.
Not verbally.
Right. But as the visit approaches
Yes.
and the mother is more and more anxious and
Right.
she wants to reassure the child
Yep.
that they'll be okay, I mean, how does the child receive that,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Exactly. The child's going to perceive. Well, it's that's kind of the mom projecting her own insecurities, her own worry onto the child, and it should be onto the father. And that's just an example of that old primitive defense mechanism called projection. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Good parents need to manage their emotions.
Yeah.
They could be anxious, they could be depressed, but they need to manage them and continue to be a parent.
In general, do you feel like child custody evaluations help the court to make very critical decisions when the parents simply can't?
Yes, I do, especially in high conflict divorces. Because with high conflict, if the two parents are really intensely emotional, that means that their ability to make decisions, it interferes with our frontal lobe functioning, right?
Right.
And so they're not going to make good decisions. No human being is when we have intense emotions. So in those kind of situations, I think custody evaluations are really valuable.
And I will tell you, in the cases in which I've had them, we have found them hugely valuable. And most of the time, you don't go to court because
Yes.
you get valuable information, and it helps the parents to make a decision outside of the courtroom, which at the end of the day is so much better for families when, even if it's not the situation you want, you have a lot more control over what happens at a mediation table
Yes.
than you do in a courtroom.
Yeah. And I think you have a better chance with that information to determine what's in the best interest of the child. And that's the whole idea about the law.
Well, Dr. Zettel, thank you so much for what you do.
You're welcome.
And being one of the few professionals in this area willing to perform this service for the court. I really appreciate your coming.
Well, thank you.